So, your indie game sucks. This is some of the most unconstructive feedback that I've ever heard, right? And I see it all the time, especially in some of the lower years of the education I used to be in. I see it all the time, and it's really unconstructive. And most of the time, what bothers me even more is that people, especially the developers, they don't know why, or they don't understand why, or they don't get the chance to understand why, right? They hear this feedback, and people might say, "Oh, it sucks because I don't like swords" or something, right? And then as a developer, you're left wondering, "Yeah, but my game is in the medieval era. It's about medieval times. Should I replace my swords for something else? Should I make it just an archery game?" When maybe that's not the problem at all, right? And so we're gonna kind of like unpackage that feedback, and we're gonna find a way to solve that. My name's Christopher, by the way. For those that don't know, welcome to the channel. So, we're going to start with a few reasons, and we're going to end with the biggest reason as to why I think that indie games may suck. Hi to the person in chat, hi. So maybe you've been here yourself, right? I see it constantly, especially the frequent posts on Reddit, on Twitter, with people that say, I released my game. I had anywhere between 100 and 5,000 wish lists, which, by the way, really impressive either way. But now after 3 days, or after 1 day, or after 1 hour, the sales have stopped, or only my friends bought the game, and everything else, no one else has bought it, right? And that really sucks, because oftentimes those posts end with, "I'm crying," or "I'm sad," or "I'm frustrated," or "I'm never doing game development again," or anything like that. And I think that's a real shame, because I understand those people, and I've been there myself, but most importantly, people don't really understand why. And so most of the time, this has two reasons, right? Two reasons why this happens. Reason number one is poor marketing efforts. Now, I'm going to make a completely separate video on this, because marketing is a really complicated topic that I want to approach correctly, because most of the videos online, when you type in how to market your game, most of those videos, I think I've seen one or two that were somewhat close to getting it right. Most of those videos are really terrible, and there are developers Googling, "How do I market my game?" reading a bunch of articles and making a video about it, which is just not the way to go. So that's reason number one. Different video, we'll go into that a different time. The reason we're going to go into today is the game sucks. Now, again, like I said at the start, this is usually not the case, but there are some reasons as to how we can avoid it altogether. So when we know those two reasons, we have to ask ourselves, okay, how come a game is bad? How does that happen? How does a game become bad? Or not fun, I guess is a better description. This has a couple of different reasons, right? And the very, very, very first reason for that is the game lacks a, between brackets, good concept, right? So, now, you might wonder, okay, so what is a good game concept? Doesn't exist. There is no good concepts. They don't exist. But this is a mistake I see quite a lot, and especially in indie dev, I see this a lot. Most games lack a good concept, right? So someone just thought to themselves, okay, I love local multiplayer games, right? I'm gonna make one. I am going to make one. I'm gonna go into detail in a second, but this is just a genre, right? This is just a genre, nothing else. Some other examples that I've heard is, what if you have a game where knights fight each other with rubber duckies, right? This is just a theme, right? A example I had recently was, I love Hitman 3. I'm gonna make a stealth game. I'm gonna make a stealth game. And this is just a copy. Now, as you can tell from what I put in between brackets behind every single one of them, it's just a genre, just a theme, just a copy, right? Or at the very least, at the last one, there is a very small chance that you actually manage to pivot enough that it doesn't become a copy, but most of the time it's a copy. And in all of the above cases, there is no actual game here, right? Just a genre, just a theme, or just a bad copy of a different game. And so I'm going to make another video. As you might know, this is a complete pivot from other content on this channel. I'm going to make another video about how to build up a good concept. But something we can do here is figure out, okay, what information are we missing in order to make this a concept, or maybe even a good concept, right? So when we look into that, and when we're trying to look for that essential information, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions, right? Most importantly, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, how can the player win the game, right? How do they do that? Do they score points, and then once reaching a threshold, they win, right? Is that how they do that? Is that how they win the game? Or is it they kill all enemies in the level? Is that how they win the game? Or maybe it could even be they reach the end of the level. Right, that could be how to win the game. Right, there's plenty of games that do that. The Super Mario Brothers is the instant example that comes to mind, where that is the goal of the game. You need to ask yourself that question and then figure it out, right? Because without a win condition, you don't have a game, right? If I'm that's not entirely correct. There are games without a win condition, but most of the time, especially for most of the indie games that are being made, especially for people that have just started out or people that have been doing it for a few years now, they'll have a win condition, right? Something like a RimWorld or Factorio. Factorio has a win condition-ish, but also not at the same time. For people that have just started out doing it for a few years, they won't be making those types of games, I hope, and so they won't need to think about that edge case. So once you've answered that question, there's another question to answer, right? The next question you have to answer is, okay, what does the player do? Right? What did they do? And what I don't mean is they shoot zombies on this ice cream planet in order to, I don't know, do something crazy, right? They don't do that, even though that might be a cool theme, but that's not what they do. What I mean here, what actions are the player undertaking in order to win the game or in order to lose the game? If we take Super Mario Brothers as an example, in Super Mario Brothers, all you did was jump and run from left to right. I'm talking about the earlier Super Mario Brothers here, right? So definitely not Super Mario Galaxy or stuff like that. Now, people will argue here and say, yeah, but wait a minute, you also kill Goombas, and you collect coins and stars and whatever. And yes, you indeed do those things. However, they're not actions you take. There's not a button you press that helps you collect a star, right? Instead, what you do is you run from left to right, and during that action you are taking, your collision box is interacting with the collision box of the coin, and thus you collect coins, right? But it's because of you running from left to right, not any other reason, right? Equally, you are killing Goombas, or making them disappear, or whatever, because you are jumping in and landing on them, right? So it's through the action of jumping that you are killing the Goomba, you're not just killing the Goomba, right? And so you have to figure out, okay, what do my players do? What are those actions, right? And most of the time, especially if you're making 2D or 3D platformers, keeping this limited, I'd even say with any game you make, keeping this limited, the amount of actions the player has to take, is always going to be a good thing, right? Having games where players can do almost anything, especially as a solo developer, you are in for a whole circus of problems, which you just don't want. So try and keep that limited and try to really define what is it the player does, right? Physically, mechanically, this is what they have direct influence over. Then the next question, the last question you need to ask yourself in order to somewhat define your game concept a lot better is, what are my references, right? I'm talking about games. Movies can be references, but I'm just sticking to games for now. Like saying something like my game is going to be like Call of Duty isn't good enough, right? This is not clear. Because let's dissect that. If we look at Call of Duty, you have or had single player, you have multiplayer, you've got zombies. Then if we take multiplayer, right? Inside of the multiplayer game mode of Call of Duty, you have Team Deathmatch, you have Hardpoint, you have Search and Destroy, Domination, Gun Game. Can I name any other ones? There's probably a few more, but no, that's the ones I can name so far. I haven't played Call of Duty in years. And all of those game modes are wildly different from each other, right? They're not like each other at all, right? In most cases, yeah, sure. Mechanically, again, what the player does is they shoot the gun and run around and jump and a few other things and slide and dash and whatever. But how to win those modes is entirely different. So when you say my game's going to be like Call of Duty, I have no idea what that means. All I know is that it's going to be a shooter, most likely a first-person shooter, right? So instead, how can you improve this? You can say, my game is going to be like Call of Duty Zombies, for example, with special enemies from Left 4 Dead included, right? Now, I would argue there is a lot more clarifying you can do in that statement, but this is already much better than the first one. Because what you're saying here is, okay, it's going to be a first-person shooter, round-based. The win condition is surviving for as long as possible. There's no clear win condition besides some of the Easter eggs that you might be able to do, because there's no real escaping from the map. I know that you have to collect points to buy perks in order to buy more weapons, etc., etc. And I know that every few rounds, maybe, or every so often, special enemies from Left 4 Dead that are stronger, faster, have a special ability, are going to come in to make it more difficult, right? They're going to cause the spike in difficulty. I know so much more about your game now than I did when you said it was just going to be like Call of Duty. So make sure to do this. Make sure that whatever reference games you're using, whether it's Stardew or Celeste or whatever, make sure that you really define which parts of the game you are going to include, right? So make sure to do that. And if you do that, you're actually going to make the chances of your game lacking a good concept a lot smaller, right? So that kind of brings me on to a certain thing, because if you start working on your game without this information, you are what's a good analogy here? Yeah, I know. You are trying to shoot a bow and arrow with your feet in the dark, hoping for a bullseye. Now, if you can do that, great. You are an amazing person. I want to meet you. But if you think to yourself, yeah, that sounds impossible, yeah, that's what you're doing without having this information present when you start working on your game. And don't worry, if you are already in your production stage and you're already quite far along with your game, you can still answer these questions, right? You can still do this in order to further define what your game is going to be, or what it's supposed to be. So don't worry if you already started and you think like, oh, I got to start all over again. No, you don't have to. You can just answer these questions and already be well on your way of what you want. And then you can also use it as a testing point where you're like, okay, does my game actually do those things? I don't know, right? So, with that out of the way, a question for people that are watching live right now, or people that are watching a video in a week or so. If you are afraid that your indie game might suck, and you want to avoid it like flopping on release or just flopping in general, feel free to put your link to your Steam page with a demo, or to your itch.io page with a demo, and I'll play it here on stream. We'll go over like, okay, what is good, what is fun, and what can use improvement, right? And then we can also like discuss certain topics that I might not turn into full videos, right? So we can do that, and you can get one-on-one feedback just like that for your game, which I think could be really, really useful in case you're scared of it might sucking. So if you want that, feel free to pop your link in chat. So on to reason number 2, right? Reason number 2, we're halfway. Reason number 2 of your game may be sucking is that you have not focused on early testing / prototyping. Oh man, this is a big one. What I see often here is that, and especially on Reddit, I see this a lot. There's people saying like, oh, I'm running into this design problem and I'm not trying to fix it. And then in the comment, someone will say, okay, let's play your game, let's figure it out. And then they'll say, oh, but I'm afraid of my concept being stolen, or I'm afraid of my game, someone copying it and then making it their own and then selling it for millions and millions of dollars and getting away with it. First things first, don't be afraid of that. People don't care about your game idea. People don't care about your concept. It is execution that matters, right? Without that execution, it's no one's going to care about your concept. More importantly, if I made a concept right now and divided between me and one of my friends who are arguably much stronger in game design and technical design than I am, we would both come out with a very different game. Not because one of us is better than the other, even though that is the case, more because the way you execute a concept, that is what is going to matter, right? So don't worry about people stealing your idea, because it's not going to happen. Back onto the script that I've got here. So I've fallen prey to this myself, right, over the years. I spent hundreds of hours on a concept, making something, then showing it to people, learning a lot of new things, by the way, then showing it to people, and then finding out that it sucked, that it wasn't fun, that people didn't like it, whatever, right? That sucks. That sucks a lot. Like, it really does, because you spent hundreds of hours pouring your soul and your heart into something that you thought was really, really great and really fun, and then other people aren't replicating that feeling. But what if I could tell you that, sounds like sort of a pyramid scheme, what if I could tell you that you could actually still learn all those new skills that you've learned in those hundreds of hours, but at the same time, by the time you get there, once you have spent those hundreds of hours, you don't find out that people don't think it's fun. Instead, people go like, yeah, this is really great because I was testing it when you only put 10 hours in, right? If you can get to that point, then you're going to end up not wasting as much time, and you're going to actually end up at a point where your game is fun and people actually like it and will buy it. So how do you actually do this, right? Because that would be a lot better if you could do that. The first thing you have to do is organize many check-in moments, right? Now, during these check-in moments, you could also call them playtests. That is obviously a much more common name for them. During these playtests, what you have to do at the very first moment in order to even get here, you need to define what the core of your game is, right? What are the most essential mechanics, right? The things that players do. Because once you figure it out, you need to build only that, just that, right? Don't add any art that you don't need to add. Don't add any music. Don't add any sound effects unless they're like placeholder things to signal things to players, but that's a different topic. Don't add any of that. Because, and the way that my teacher said it to me a few years ago, games that are fun when it's just a white sphere running around a scene trying to win the game or either losing, right? Those will be 10 times or 100 times more fun once the art and the music and the sound and the animations and whatever else are added on top, right? Games that aren't fun on their own, when it's just white box levels and just like a little white sphere that's running around, they will not become more fun because you've added, I don't know, this ancient manner into it, and you've added all kinds of textures and materials and whatever, and special effects and whatever. Those games won't become fun all of a sudden, right? Imagine if you're making a horror game and you want to build that tension, and you cannot do that with just your white box level. That means mechanically there's something wrong, right? Because if we take Alien Isolation as an example, that game was fun in just white box mode, right? The developers there, they very much said, okay, this game is fun even though it doesn't look pretty at all, and there is no big scary monster running after me. It's just like a little AI sphere that's running after me. It is still fun, right? And then when you add that monster in there, and the abandoned spaceship, and the little VFX of the sparks flying, and like the blood decals on the windows and stuff like that, it becomes insanely more tense, right? And that's what you want to achieve. So define what the core of your game is, define what those most essential mechanics are, build only that, okay? Then once you have that, start with those playtests, right? And in order to test whether or not you're succeeding or whether people think it's fun, set up clear testing criteria, right? Criteria, like that. What I mean with this, and what I did in my own game, and we're going to go into that a little bit later on, what I did in my own game for this is I said, in the very, very, very first playtest, I said, do people feel pressured to reach the end, right? The answer was a complete yes from the playtest that I did, and so I knew, okay, that is one thing that I wanted to achieve with this game. I've achieved that. Let's keep building, right? If the answer would have been a resounding no, and I would have asked people, okay, but do you think you could be? Do you think there's something causing you to not feel pressured? Can I change that? And they would have said, no, there's nothing you can do. I just don't feel pressured. I don't think this can work. Then I know, okay, I've spent, I don't know, 12, 16 hours on this. I can scrap it and move on to the next idea on the list that is like 600 miles long because I've got way too many ideas. And and I can just move on, right? I haven't spent too much time on one thing that makes me lose all that time all of a sudden. I've still learned new things, right? Because I set up a game that I've never set up before. But I'm now continuing on to something else that I think might be fun instead, right? So make sure to set up those clear testing criteria so that you can figure out if your concept, if your prototype is good enough to continue working on. Then additionally, also to kind of like grab an extra example here, I guess, something you could also say is like, I want my players to find the next resource themselves, right? If you're working on like a survival game or maybe like a factory type game, you could say as a testing criteria, okay, I want to see if my players can find the next resource themselves, if that step makes sense in their heads. If you can see people just struggling and they're just sticking with the first resource, you know that there's something that needs to change, right? You know they need to add something or remove something or something of the kind. But if people say like, oh yeah, no, I did see that resource, but I just thought I didn't need it, or I couldn't use it, or I didn't have the right technology for it, then you know, okay, this is where I need to start building something, okay? So do that, because it's going to help you find out what you want to do. Then once you've set up those testing criteria, test. If there was one advice I could give to any developer for their entire career, it'd be this, right? Test. You cannot expect your game to be good if you are not testing it with other people, right? Because at some point you become blind as a developer. You become blind to what is wrong with your game. You need to put it in front of other people, and those don't have to be game developers, preferably not. Preferably they're players that you're targeting, and they need to play it, because they will show you through their own actions, completely unaware of what you're trying to do, they will show you what is wrong with your game, right? I had this the other day where one of my playtesters was playing it, and they played a few of the earlier versions as well, and they were just not dashing, right? There was a nice little UI icon that showed when you could dash and when you couldn't dash, like when it was on cooldown, and they just weren't using it. Like at all, even for the sections of the level that required dashing, or at least, you know, unless you wanted to make it really difficult for yourself, they required dashing, they just weren't doing it. They kept dying on the same piece over and over and over because they were like, oh no, I'll make this with jumping, right? They didn't say that, but they just weren't dashing. So at that point I know, okay, something's not clear. I need to showcase to players, I need to make a scenario where they can only make it if they dash, and then give them some kind of prompt like, hey, dash here, or something of the kind. And that is, I only found out about that because I was testing, right? So please do that. Then, once you have had those many check-in moments, after every check-in moment, you have to ask yourself, this is going to sound a little gruesome, do I kill my baby? And I'll put behind brackets, project. I remember my teacher in the very first year, he said this in like week 2. I just started this education, and I was like, okay, this is a lot of fun, and I really love doing this, and the people around me are really great. And his teacher just goes like, okay, so we're gonna learn today about how to kill your babies. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. And he very quickly, kind of explained what that is, so I'm gonna do the same thing. What this means, like I said, your baby is your project, right? And what I see a lot with indie game devs, and what is a very, very apparent concern in the general game dev community, is that people treat every single concept like it's their baby, right? God forbid if I say something about it that you might not like, because that's your baby, and I'm calling it ugly, and you're like, it's not ugly, it's just my little special child. And like, don't do that. A very good rule of thumb, and I'm not exaggerating on these numbers, but a very good rule of thumb is that your first 20 concepts will suck. Simple as that. And this is why it's so incredibly important to playtest a lot and to move on quickly if you see that it's not working. Because imagine, like a lot of Reddit posts have shown over the past few weeks, working on your game for 3 years, learning everything from scratch because you weren't a game developer beforehand, and then finding out that it doesn't sell. Imagine doing that 20 times. We're talking 60 years, so I can do quick math. We're talking 60 years worth of work that you would put in on each of your on your concepts, on your first 20 concepts, because you are unwilling to move on from a concept when you see it doesn't work. 60 years. That is a lifetime, right? If you acknowledge that your first 20 concepts are probably, most likely, definitely going to suck, and you can only spend, I don't know, 2 days on each concept right before moving on, we're talking 40 days, right? I can't do the math between 60 years and 40 days and what the difference is, but you get the point. So please keep that in mind. If you see that your testing criteria aren't being met, right, don't try and make it work. Just say, okay, this currently doesn't do well enough. I need to move on to something else, right? Because maybe in a year from now, you're going to look back at that old concept that you scrapped because you decided to move on to something else, and you've in the meantime killed 6 or 7 more concepts. You're going to look back and be like, well, maybe if I do this and this, or if I apply these things that I've learned from these other 6 concepts. Thanks for the follow, whoever that was. I can't see your name right now. I'll look at it in just a moment. Mr. Bacon X, thank you. You're appreciated. If you look back at the concept you're making back at the start of the year that you scrapped then because you decided, okay, I need to move on to something else, you might learn from those things that you can apply into that very first concept, right? And then you might start in your 21st concept and be like, oh yeah, this might work. And then you test it and people are like, yeah, this is fun. And then you can start putting those hours in, right? Then you can start testing. And I'm gonna continue on that in just a moment. But I want to have a slight anecdote here. I think for me, in the past 6 years now that I've been developing games, both AAA and indie, I think on my own, concepts that only I worked on, there must have been 40 of them at least. 40. And I think in total, 37 of those were absolute trash, and I have scrapped. And I think 3 of those were kind of good enough to continue. But 2 out of those 3 I've scrapped by now, and they're dead for quite a while now. And the last one, the one that remains, is the one I'm currently working on. And after now 5 or 6 versions of that game, it is still looking very good. It is becoming more and more concrete. People are saying they like it, they're having fun, etc., etc. And so I think that for the very first time, this one concept out of the 40 that I've done might maybe become something that'll be fun to play. And that doesn't even mean it's going to sell, but at the very minimum, it'll be fun to play, right? So keep that in mind. Keep those numbers in mind, okay? It's okay to fail here. It's okay if those first 20 concepts suck. That is not a problem, okay? Because especially, and I'll end on this note for this reason, the strength of a good game developer, equals knowing when to stop putting time into something. This counts for both indie and AAA. Knowing when a feature needs to be scrapped or when a game needs to be scrapped is going to save you time, money, and a whole load of heartache and disappointment later on down the line. And it's going to make you just an infinitely better game developer than the next person, right? So keep that in mind. Then there's one more thing you should do in order to really focus on the early testing, early prototyping. You have to test the small parts of the game, right? Test the smaller parts of the game. And small is not meant in size here. Small is meant in the sense of these are things that people don't tend to pay attention to. Especially game developers. Players pay attention to this in a subconscious level, but developers tend to forget about these things. So let's say you've determined that your indie game is meeting all the testing criteria. Yay, woo, party time, right? Well, that is right. You should absolutely party in between those moments, right? Absolutely. But now you have to start spending a lot more time on the other parts of your game, right? You have to think, okay, how am I going to test these other parts, right? And which other parts do I need to test, right? Because the amount of times, I can't even begin to count the number of indie games that I've played where I'm like, this is a really cool game, a really cool concept, and then I'm forced to deal with a clunky camera, or a bad movement set, or even worse, a weird control scheme that's not explained properly. It just breaks that whole experience down into nothing, right? And that's a shame because you don't want that. If we pull a reference from Super Mario Brothers, which is just a great reference overall, when you play any of the Super Mario Brothers, right, from the very first one to the latest one, which is Odyssey, I think it's Odyssey. you're looking at a movement set. You're looking at a camera that has been tested thousands of times, right? Um, I'm gonna write that down just for impact, right? Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Brothers movement has been tested 1,000 times. Now, I don't know anyone personally at Nintendo, and if someone from Nintendo happens to be watching and you want to correct me, feel free to go ahead. But I can attest to this. The Super Mario Brothers movement has been tested 1,000 times, over and over and over and over. I need to finish my sentences. There we go. And so when you make your own game, I'm not saying you have to test it 1,000 times, but more than twice, I would definitely recommend, right? You have to make sure that, especially in those earlier prototypes, in those earlier tests you're doing, you have to make sure you get a really good feeling for what your players like in terms of movement or in terms of the camera, right? Especially if you're making a 3D platformer or a 2D platformer. If we take as reference Super Mario 3D World, I know I'm taking a lot of Mario references, but they're just really easy in this context. When you start moving to the left in the world, the camera, which is usually like this behind the player, doesn't instantly follow along, right? The player starts moving, and after about half a second, the camera slowly builds up in speed and kind of like matches the player again. It's this kind of like camera lag that causes me as a player to have a really good feeling of, oh, that feels nice and smooth. And I don't think about it, I don't think those words in my head, but subconsciously, that's what I'm noticing, right? If the camera moves instantly and like instantly stops, I know that feels jarring. That doesn't feel nice, right? Because my eyes aren't adjust to things instantly stopping or instantly moving again, because that's not how things move in real life, right? So make sure to think about those things. Additionally, as a different example, because I need to stop quoting Mario and everything, because they're definitely not perfect, but they are very good in some ways. If you're looking at like RTS games, the way the camera moves is sublime in some examples. Some games get it really wrong, but in some examples, Age of Empires, very, very good. And they thought about that. They tested that over and over and over in white box areas. People didn't really know what they were testing, especially the playtesters were like, what is this game? They could order some units around or some gray squares around, and that was it, right? But the way the camera moved is what they were looking for. And so they tested this and over and over and over again to come to a result that really allowed them to have something really smooth. Now, I'm going to give a slight tip here, and this is off script. You can figure out what these things are, especially for camera and for movement. You can figure out what these really nice, smooth feeling things are through another way besides testing, right? Because there is a lot of information on the internet nowadays. There's a lot of places where you can go, a lot of like Gamma Sutra articles or GDC videos that will tell you how to make movement feel nice and smooth, right? There's a wealth of resources around that, and you should absolutely look it up and make sure that you apply it to your own game, right? Try to find the smoothest way for your movement to feel and your camera to feel, because those two things is something the player will interact with constantly and should not be neglected. Yeah, that is that part. So I can hear the question already. Which parts should I focus on? Should I focus on? Very easy. I have a list here to the side of me. Movement, camera, controls. That is a very good one. Make sure your controls feel natural. I was playing Celeste the other day for the very first time. I loved it. Well, I liked it. I didn't love it, but I liked it. But the Xbox controller having to hold left trigger for climbing, I don't know why they made that choice. I'm sure there's a wealth of knowledge there that they made that choice. But personally, I thought it was a bad choice. I did not like it. I thought it was confusing, and I would much rather had right trigger in order to do that, because it feels a lot more natural. Especially when you've played a lot of FPS games, right trigger is something you use quite a bit. So yeah, make sure to look at controls. Then some other things, level design clarity. If we look at games like Left 4 Dead, for example, in all of their levels, they used lighting a lot to inform the player where they wanted to go, where they should go in order to complete the level. Usually there was like a little light near a door or like a light on a billboard. I think one of their examples is that there was this big billboard with like an arrow that was like glowing in like this like neon LED type lighting. and it was really like part of the level, and it was really part of the environment, but that arrow points towards where you should go next. So players, they don't think of this as like, oh, I'm getting a clue where to go. No, they see that arrow, and instinctively, from like a natural perspective, their brain goes like, hey, that arrow is pointing at something. What's that pointing at? And off they run, right? You haven't belittled your player for not knowing where to go, and instead you guided them to where they needed to go, very subconsciously, and they've done it, right? So that's something you should really look into. Then on top of that, the last one is UI UX clarity. Now this goes for any type of game, regardless of genre or type. You need to make sure that the players understand what they're looking at, and you need to make sure that the players get the right cues, right? So when a certain ability recharges, give them a little sound cue. Give them a little UI cue, like a little wiggle of the icon or something that indicates to their brain, hey, this part of the screen is asking for attention. What is it about? Oh, my dash has recharged. Okay, I can use it again, right? This all happens in a split second, but make sure you take a look at that. Make sure you test that quite a bit, because games live and die by their UI and their UX. So make sure to take a look at that. Now, we're getting there. We're getting there. Last reason, the biggest one that I found where I'm like, oh man, this is probably why this project failed. And I'm gonna have a quick sip so I don't end up with a dry mouth. Because the amount of bad documentation I see is astounding to me. And so the last reason, one of the biggest reasons why your game might suck, is the complete lack of good documentation and documentation structure, right? To go into detail on this, in the past 6 years, I've been part of quite a few also like team projects, like indie team projects, and it is almost embarrassing to say that I have gone through multiple like 400-page game design documents and like multiple hours of devlogs in order to understand what the game was about. Now, specifically about devlogs, I will go into that in a different video because it's a bit complicated, because there's some good things about it but some bad things, so I don't really want to include that into this topic, but separate topic instead. But especially the game design documents, those 400 pages, they are never ever failed. The ones I've seen have never ever been failed with, okay, what are the mechanics of my game? What are the dynamics? What are the aesthetics? What is the core loop? What is the win condition? What's the lose condition? What are the feature specs for all of these different features? I have never seen that type of stuff in a game design document. The only things I've read in a game design document is my game is going to be about knights fighting each other with rubber duckies, and the game is about a knight called Barry who has a rubber ducky called James, and Barry uses James to punch Geraldine in the face, right? And then they get a point and then they win, right? And even that last bit is usually not part of it, because then they go into some backstory on Barry and James, where they met, how they were orphans, and how they grew up in the castle together and whatever, you know, that kind of stuff. None of that will ever help you to make a good game. So please don't waste your time on that. Instead, I want to show you two pieces of documentation that I've used for my project, that I'm currently using for my projects, in order to develop something really nice, or at least what so far through playtests has turned out to be quite nice. So first one is a what did I call it again? Scrolling through my, yeah, okay, there it is. Level design document, right? This is very vague, but don't worry, I've got an example for you. A real example of what I'm using, like I was using this yesterday. Here we go. Right, so this is my World 1 level design matrix. This has all of the information that I need in order to build the levels in the first world of my game. For example, the first thing I have is level structure for new mechanics. When I introduce a new mechanic in a level, I first have a section where that new mechanic is introduced, then I develop on that mechanic, right? There's another section. Then the third section is I twist how the mechanic can be used. So the player kind of goes like, oh, hey, this is a different application of the mechanic that I was just taught. And then I end with a conclusion on that mechanic, which is usually some kind of like skill challenge to, you know, really make sure that the player understands how the mechanic is used and how it's interacted with. Then on top of that, in my case, it's a 3D platformer. I have an entire matrix of things that I can use in my levels, right? So, for example, the phase platform has identification code 3. Right now, what does that mean? We'll get back to that in just a second. And then on top of that, on this first page, which is like a legend page, I also have identified, okay, how do I recognize level beats? I'm going to make this into a separate video as well. How do I recognize level beats inside my level so I know where the levels are too easy and where they're too hard when I'm designing them? Then I also have a world overview document, or a page, tab, whatever. I made this, by the way, in Google Sheets. It's free. It's really easy to use. I definitely recommend it if you're making levels like this. I've laid out, okay, how do I want to spread out my levels and what do I want to teach in each of my levels. And then I've laid out, okay, for all of the different mechanics I have, how does that build up throughout the world, right? How does that challenge build up? So in this case, right, jumping is the only thing that you do in level 1.1. That level takes 1 minute, roughly, right? It's always an estimation. But I first make sure I teach jumping. Then in level 1.2, I have jumping, and I've introduced a new mechanic, moving platforms that go sideways, right? So I then show the player, okay, now that you've learned how to jump and how these different situations can affect you, here's a new situation in which you can apply your skill, right? Then in 1.3, I do the same thing, but it's a little harder, right? And then just like that, I keep going and I keep introducing new things. So in this one, there's vertical moving platforms. In this one, I introduce dashing, right? And I keep going and on and so forth until I come all the way towards the end of World 1. I've decided which mechanics I want to use, and as you can see, it gradually builds up towards a final challenge. So how does that translate into actual full-on level design? Because how have I made this document even more useful for my process so that my game does not suck at the end, hopefully? I have included a page for every single level that I've designed so far. Last night I made the decision to add 2 extra sections into each of my level sections, so they're not filled in yet. But in essence, because my levels exists out of 3x3 sets of tiles, I can identify really easily what those tiles are going to be. So we know that through the legend, we know that code 0 is a normal platform. We know that a hyphen is no platform. Right, so in this level, we know, okay, we've got just normal platforms here. Then these are going to be, there's no platforms there, so the player kind of has, oh, I'm going to have to move left here, right? And so they learn moving left and right. Then here, we've got identification code C1. C1, let's see what it is, here it is a 1-gap jump. How is this different from just having no platforms and still just having like a 1-gap jump? When I do a 1-gap jump, I make sure there's platforms beneath it so that at the very first moment, the player learns how far they can jump without being in imminent danger, right? And then as we go on in this level, there's a few more moments where it gets a little more challenging. That's what the orange stands for. And, the player has to jump twice, right? And then all the way at the end, there's going to be some kind of challenge where the player will have to jump over actual areas that are not covered by platforms below it, so they could fail there, right? They could lose. And that's how I've built up each of my levels. Now, let me first say this is, of course, a lot of information. I might make these documents into templates. If people in chat, if they say like, oh yeah, make some templates, I'd love to see. I'll do that. But also there's a lot of information here, so don't worry if you're like confused or whatever. Ask your questions in a second once we get to the Q&A part, and then we'll go through it. But yeah, this is how I make this document even more of value to me, right? It's not a 400-page level design document that shows each of the levels individually and whatever. No, it is a very concise Google Sheets document where I know exactly what each level does, how it's designed, and how it's paced out for the player, right? And I've done this for every single level up to level 5. I haven't started with level 6 yet, but they get more and more complex as you go along. So that is document number 1 that I use in order to bring value to my process, right? Then the second one is a feature change sheet. Now, what do I mean by that? Again, I've got an example for you because I came prepared today. There you go, like that. So what have I done here? I have taken every single variable that influences how the player interacts with the game, right? So not like the score points being increased or decreased, stuff like that. Variables that actually influence how the player interacts with the game. I've collected them here, and through every single version, I have documented what the value of those variables was. Why have I done this? I'll get to that in just a moment. Because we can see here that for movement, moving the character on the vertical and horizontal axes, right? Easy feature. The walk speed, the max walk speed, was 600 in version 1, then 900 in version 1.1, then 850 in version 1.2, and so on and so forth. For a different example, for the jumping up and down, there is a coyote jump grace period. If you're making a platformer, look into coyote jumps. It's a very neat little feature to give your players an extra handhold when they're going through levels. We can see here that this feature didn't exist in the first few versions. It only came about in version 1.5, and so that's where I've then added a value. Now, why do I do this? I do this because this way, when I'm testing, when people say like, oh, like someone's testing version 1.6 and they're like, I don't know, the movement feels too slow, right? And I keep hearing this from more people. Then I can look back and I'm like, okay, so 850 is too slow. I've tried 900 before and people said it was too fast. Well, maybe for version 1.6, I should try 875, right? That is the thought process you're going to go through in order to further improve your game and make sure that people kind of come to terms with what it is and that they feel like it's a smooth experience. But this way it also stops you from trying things you've done before, because you can see what you've done before and you can change it based on that. Right? Maybe they think it's actually too slow because I have decreased the max acceleration. Right? These are two different test cases you can have, and then test it with your players, and then say, okay, how does this feel? And then once you get closer and closer to that, you'll get to a point where people will say, okay, yeah, this is good. For me, that happened in version 1.2 with 850, and so I've kept it as 850 through the next few versions. So these are two pieces of documentation that I use in order to help myself in this process and make sure that my game at least has less of a chance of sucking by the time I release it. So with that all coming to a conclusion, to me, in my opinion, there are 3 reasons why your indie game might suck. It either lacks a good concept, right, which means your concept just doesn't have enough information defined. You have not focused enough on the early testing or the prototyping, which means you need to do many checking moments, set up clear testing criteria, and then just test, and know when to stop working on a project and when to continue. And then also just a complete lack of any useful documentation. If you avoid or if you work on these things for your project, whether it's already like almost done or you're just getting started, you are significantly reducing the chance that your game will flop by the end of it, right? So another thing that I should leave you with, when you are testing your own game, let's say you don't have the opportunity to test it with a lot of people. That happens. I've met people that really only have like a brother or a sister, or not even that, or just like one friend, or they only have themselves that they can test with. That's a shame, and I'm sorry that's the case, but when that happens, you need to think of it, okay, from a player's perspective, what is the number one thing that I personally hate in my reference games, right? In the games that I'm basing this off. If you think of it from that perspective, you're going to find moments in your game where you're like, wait a minute, my game is doing that thing that I always hate about the other games, and you'll be able to iterate based on that, right? It's not a foolproof way, but it's definitely a way to test a bit when you don't have a lot of people around you that can test. Also, in terms of how many people you should test with, try at the very minimum five different people to test your game, just to get a lot of different opinions. Also because, Super Mario Brother was tested with like thousands of times, and their testing groups tend to range anywhere between 30 and 100 per testing session. You don't have the budget for that or the resources for that, so that's a good. But to try to test it with 5 different people, or just as many people as you can, to get the results that you're looking for, or at least to get results at the very minimum. So please make sure to think of these things when you are making your own game, because trust me, it's going to make sure that your game sucks less, and it's going to save you a lot of heartache in the long run, and it's going to make sure that that you don't end up failing, because that's the thing you want to avoid, right? So that concludes the video. For the people that are watching this as a video in a week from now, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe, bell, all that stuff if you think I deserved it. And then beyond that, leave in the comments what you hate about games, about your reference games. And let's discuss those things. Let's figure out what's going on there, and let's find good solutions that you can use in your own game. For people that are watching the live stream, we're going to continue in a second with the Q&A section, and then we're going to play some of your demos or demos that I've collected beforehand, and we're going to play through that and just kind of like go through the feedback process and kind of let you guys can see what things I pay attention to when I'm playing games, also from a AAA perspective, and what kind of things that you might want to look at with your own game. Okay, so for people in the video, thank you for watching. Goodbye, and see you in the next one.